The morning sun had barely crept over the treetops when Derek Johnson slung his rifle over his shoulder and stepped off his porch. The air was cool, damp with the scent of pine and fresh earth, and the forest behind his cabin hummed with life. Hunting wasn't just a pastime for Derek, it was tradition. As a decorated Army veteran, he had learned to survive in harsher conditions than these, and now, after retirement, the woods had become both his refuge and his therapy. Every deer trail he tracked, every sunrise he watched through the scope, reminded him that life outside the chaos of war could still be peaceful, simple, and free. But that morning, as he returned home with nothing but a few rabbits in his game bag, Derek noticed something unusual: an envelope taped to the rusty iron gate at the edge of his property. The paper was stiff, white, and official-looking, completely out of place against the wilderness that surrounded his home. He frowned, tore it from the gate, and opened it right there in the dirt driveway. Inside was a letter that made his jaw tighten. It was a notice from the local homeowners association, stamped and signed at the bottom. Bold letters screamed across the top: "Violation notice, unauthorized hunting." The fine, it declared, was set at $5,000. Derek blinked, then read it again. The HOA claimed that he had been endangering the community image by hunting within the boundaries of their controlled area. They insisted that such activities were strictly prohibited under their bylaws. Derek's hands tightened around the paper. Community image? He almost laughed. His cabin sat at the far end of the county line, surrounded by nothing but forest and creeks. He wasn't even part of their HOA. He had chosen this land years ago precisely because it gave him space, freedom, and no meddling neighbors. The land where he hunted was state-owned public property, wide open and perfectly legal for him to use with his license and tags. The HOA had no jurisdiction there. Yet here they were, trying to stretch their authority like a net cast too wide. Derek could almost hear their smug voices in his head, the kind he'd overheard once or twice at the grocery store. Wealthy suburban homeowners who had moved in from the city, convinced they could buy the countryside and reshape it into their private park. To them, his hunting gear wasn't tradition, it was dangerous. His cabin wasn't a home, it was an eyesore. And now, apparently, his freedom to walk the woods with a rifle was something they thought they could fine out of existence. He folded the paper slowly, slid it into his jacket, and walked back toward the cabin with heavy steps. $5,000 was no small sum, but it wasn't the money that bothered him. It was the arrogance. He had put his life on the line for a country where people were supposed to live free, yet here he was being told by a committee of desk-sitters that he couldn't hunt in the woods behind his own home. By the time he reached his porch again, Derek's mind was no longer calm. He knew exactly what he had to do. They wanted to fight. Well, he had fought tougher enemies before, and this time, the battlefield was his own backyard. Derek wasn't the type of man to let things slide, not when his dignity was on the line. A week after receiving the fine, he drove into town, parked his old pickup outside the HOA's grand clubhouse, and walked inside. The building itself was the very picture of polished suburbia: white columns, fresh landscaping, and a marble-floored lobby that smelled faintly of expensive coffee. It stood in stark contrast to his worn camo jacket, muddy boots, and weathered hands, but Derek didn't care. He'd faced generals in starched uniforms and foreign leaders behind polished tables. This bunch of paper pushers wasn't going to shake him. The boardroom was crowded, with residents sipping bottled water and flipping through thick packets of printed community guidelines. At the head of the table sat Gregory Whitman, the HOA president, a man with slick-back silver hair and a designer suit that probably cost more than Derek's entire truck. Gregory's smile was cold, the kind that hid daggers. "Mr. Johnson," he said with mock politeness as Derek walked in, "so glad you could join us. Please take a seat." Derek remained standing, pulling the violation notice from his pocket and holding it up for the room. "I received this last week. You fined me $5,000 for hunting. The problem is, I don't live under your HOA. My land is outside your jurisdiction, and the property where I was hunting belongs to the state. I have legal permits for every activity I've done. He set the paper down on the polished wood table, his voice steady but hard. A murmur ran through the crowd, but Gregory only chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair with his fingers steepled. Ah, yes. Technically, your cabin sits just outside our current borders. But what you fail to realize, Mr. Johnson, is that our community is expanding. We're in negotiations to lease the hiking trails and surrounding woodland. Once finalized, all activity within that area will fall under our jurisdiction. Meaning, he let the words hang and several board members smirked. You'll be expected to comply with our rules or face consequences. The arrogance in his tone made Derek's jaw clench, but he forced himself to stay calm. So, what you're saying is, you fine me for something you don't even own yet. Gregory waved a dismissive hand. Think of it as proactive enforcement. We like to get ahead of these things. Hunting doesn't align with the community image we're building here. We're aiming for family-friendly trails, yoga retreats, picnic areas. Not his eyes flicked up and down Derek's frame, dead animals hanging on porches and men tromping around with rifles. A ripple of laughter spread across the table. Some covered their mouths politely. Others outright sneered, their eyes filled with the kind of disdain Derek had seen before, the kind that said, "You don't belong here." He remembered the whispers he'd caught at the grocery store, the sideways glances when he came into town after a long day in the woods. These people weren't neighbors, they were judges, jury, and executioners, and they had already decided that Derek Johnson was guilty of being different. Derek leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table. "I fought for this country," he said, his voice low but commanding, silencing the chuckles. "I earned the right to live free on my land, to enjoy the outdoors without someone like you telling me otherwise. You think your bylaws are bigger than state law? Than federal law? You're wrong. I'm not moving. I'm not changing. And I sure as hell am not paying this fine." For a brief moment, silence hung heavy over the room. Then Gregory's smile widened into a smirk. "We'll see about that, Mr. Johnson. You may think you're untouchable, but rules are rules. And here we make the rules." The meeting ended with whispers and smug looks, but as Derek walked out into the bright afternoon sun, he felt no defeat. If anything, the fire in his chest burned hotter. They thought they could intimidate him. They thought they could erase him with paperwork and arrogance. But Derek had faced worse than this. And now, he knew he would not only fight them, he would beat them at their own game. That night, long after the sun had gone down and the woods had fallen into their usual chorus of crickets and distant owls, Derek sat at the worn oak desk in his cabin with nothing but a cup of black coffee, his laptop, and the stubborn weight of determination pressing on his shoulders. He couldn't let it go. The smugness on Gregory Whitman's face, the laughter of the board, the way they spoke as though his freedom were just an inconvenience to be signed away with a few strokes of a pen. He had dealt with men like that before, men who hid power behind polished shoes and paperwork, men who thought rules existed only to protect their own interests. They underestimated him, just as enemies had on the battlefield, and Derek knew from experience that underestimation was always their first mistake. He pulled up the County Land Records website, an outdated government portal with clunky search features that most people wouldn't bother navigating. But Derek was patient. He clicked through maps, deeds, zoning reports, and old legal filings until the details began to form a picture clearer than the HOA's false claims. The land they were salivating over, the hiking trails, the creeks, the woods they pretended to control, wasn't theirs. In fact, it wasn't anyone's, at least not in the sense the HOA believed. The property, over 400 acres of untouched forest, had once belonged to a local farmer named Walter Henderson, a man who passed away nearly 15 years ago. The records showed the land was inherited by his children, but they had long since moved out of state, leaving it tangled in probate and quietly listed for sale through a small rural law office. It had been sitting there all this time, unnoticed, because the average buyer didn't want to deal with the bureaucratic hassle. Derek leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It was almost laughable. The HOA had threatened him over land they didn't even own. All they had were negotiations, hollow promises to homeowners, and the assumption that no one else would challenge them. But here it was plain as day. The land was still up for grabs, still open to anyone willing to step into the ring and claim it. Derek's military mind ticked through the options. He could ignore it, continue to fight their fines, let the HOA waste money on lawyers until they realized they had no jurisdiction. But that path was slow, reactive, and left him at their mercy. No, if there was one thing his years of service had taught him, it was that the best defense was offense. Why fight over scraps when he could take the whole table? His eyes shifted to the deed number on the screen, the contact information for the law office buried at the bottom of the listing. He jotted it down on a notepad with steady hands, already thinking several moves ahead like a soldier planning an operation. If he bought the land outright, the HOA would have nothing. Their grand plans of yoga retreats and family-friendly picnics would crumble before they even started. Better yet, he would control the very trails they loved to brag about, the ones they mocked him for using. The thought made a rare smile tug at his lips. It wasn't just about revenge, though that was sweet. It was about principle. They thought they could bully him with bylaws, but real power didn't sit in a clubhouse with catered lunches. Real power was ink on a deed, boots on the ground, the kind of authority no smug committee could argue with. As the night wore on and the coffee in his mug turned cold, Derek's plan solidified. He would call the lawyers in the morning, get the ball rolling, and quietly, without any of them realizing, cut the legs out from under the HOA before they could take another step. They had drawn first blood with their fine, but Derek was about to end the war before it even started. And as the fire crackled in the wood stove and the forest whispered outside his window, he thought to himself that maybe fate had handed him this fight for a reason, because men like Gregory needed to learn what happened when they pushed the wrong soldier too far. The morning after his late-night discovery, Derek rose before dawn, as he always did, but instead of reaching for his rifle, he poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and pulled out the notepad where he had scribbled the law office's contact information. The thought of what he was about to do sent a current of excitement through his chest, sharper than the thrill of a hunt. He dialed the number and listened to the faint static before a weary secretary answered. Derek introduced himself, explained his interest in the Henderson estate property, and within minutes was transferred to a lawyer who sounded more surprised than anything else. "You're the first serious caller we've had about that land in over a decade," the man admitted. "It's been sitting in limbo because most buyers don't want to deal with the probate headaches." Derek chuckled low. "Headaches I can deal with. Paperwork doesn't scare me." He had faced red tape in the military, and again when he built his contracting business after retiring. Patience was one of his sharpest weapons. Over the next few weeks, Derek devoted himself to the process. He drove to the county courthouse, combed through dusty records, and met with the Henderson heirs over video calls. They were tired of paying property taxes on land they never used, and Derek's straightforward manner appealed to them. He wasn't some slick developer. He was a man who respected the land, who wanted to preserve its wilderness rather than pave it over. Negotiations were tense at times, especially when one of the heirs hinted they'd been approached by community representatives before. Clearly, Gregory's HOA had already tried to sink their claws into the property, but the deal had never gone through because the HOA had tried to lowball them. Derek, however, came prepared with a fair offer, one backed by years of savings and his clean business record. By the end of the month, contracts were drawn, signed, and notarized. Derek Johnson, hunter, veteran, outsider, was now the legal owner of over 400 acres of forest, creek, and trails. The irony made him grin every time he thought about it. The very land the HOA had claimed in that meeting, the land Gregory had smugly used to threaten him, now belonged to him. The first thing he did after the deed was finalized was drive out to the trailheads, hammering up signs he had printed at a local shop. "Private property, NO trespassing, violators will be prosecuted." The bold black letters stood out against the trees like silent sentinels, and Derek felt a deep satisfaction as he stepped back to admire them. To seal the message, he hired a fencing company from town, men he knew from his veteran circles, to put up barriers at the most popular access points. They didn't ask questions. One look at Derek's determined face told them everything. By the end of the week, the entrances to the trails were blocked, and word began to spread like wildfire through the community. Joggers found themselves stopped by padlocked gates. Families planning picnics were turned back by the signs, and whispers of confusion filled the HOA's neat cul-de-sacs. To Derek, it was more than just a legal victory, it was justice. For years, they had tried to shape the world into their perfect image, erasing anyone who didn't fit. Now, the balance had shifted. The ground beneath their pride, the very land they flaunted in glossy brochures and real estate ads, had been pulled out from under them. Standing on his new property, rifle slung over his shoulder, Derek breathed in the scent of pine and freedom and thought, not for the first time, that the fight was far from over. The real battle would come when the HOA realized the truth, and he was more than ready to face it. The uproar started almost immediately like a nest of hornets that had been kicked wide open. Within days of Derek's signs going up, the HOA community was in chaos. Homeowners who had once boasted about exclusive hiking access to prospective buyers now found themselves staring at locked gates, their morning jogs and weekend trail walks abruptly ended. Rumors swirled in neighborhood Facebook groups. Some swore it was a temporary closure for maintenance, others muttered about legal disputes, but none of them knew the truth until Gregory Whitman, red-faced and seething, called an emergency HOA meeting. Derek didn't plan on attending, but when he received a typed letter slipped into his mailbox, labeled Mandatory Community Meeting, he decided to show up anyway, if only to enjoy the spectacle. The room was packed tighter than the last time, with furious residents waving flyers and demanding answers. Gregory stood at the front, pounding the table for order, his perfect composure from before now cracked with visible frustration. "This man," Gregory thundered, pointing a trembling finger at Derek, "has single-handedly stolen our community trails. He shut them down, put up signs, blocked access, all without authority." Derek, leaning casually against the back wall, let the accusations hang for a moment before stepping forward. Without a word, he pulled a folder from under his arm and slid it across the boardroom table. Inside was a crisp, notarized copy of the deed with his name emblazoned at the bottom. "Authority?" Derek said coolly, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "I've got plenty. That's my land now. Bought it, paid for it, and signed it into law. You can check the county records if you don't believe me." The room erupted in gasps and whispers, homeowners craning their necks to see. Gregory's face went pale, his lips parting as he read the document. And for the first time, the smug president looked like a man cornered. This is outrageous," he stammered, trying to recover. "You can't just— This land was meant for the community, for everyone's enjoyment. You can't close it off." Derek crossed his arms, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "Funny thing about land ownership. You can do whatever the law allows, and the law's on my side. You wanted to fine me for using land that wasn't even yours. Now it is mine, and the only rules here are mine too." Several board members shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado gone. Some residents began shouting questions. "What about our property values? We were promised trails when we bought here. How could this happen?" The meeting devolved into chaos, accusations flying in every direction, but Derek stood like stone, unshaken by the noise. He had lived through artillery fire and ambushes in places far deadlier than this polished clubhouse. Their anger was nothing more than background static. When Gregory tried to threaten legal action, Derek leaned in, his eyes steady. "Go ahead. Sue me. I've already spoken to the county attorneys, and my ownership is airtight. Every dollar you waste in court will be one less you spend maintaining your pretty little neighborhood." The silence that followed was deafening, and though Gregory tried to keep his composure, the homeowners could see the truth plain as day. The HOA had lost. As Derek turned to leave, he caught sight of faces in the crowd, some furious, some stunned, and a few, surprisingly, that seemed almost amused, as though they respected the man for pulling off something so bold. Walking out into the crisp evening air, Derek allowed himself a small smile. The board had wanted to play games with him, but now they were the ones trapped in the mess they had created, and this was only the beginning of their downfall. The fallout from Derek's move spread faster than wildfire, and by the time hunting season rolled around, the HOA was in shambles. Homeowners who had once paraded their neighborhood as a premier community with nature trails now found realtors turning away buyers when they asked about outdoor access. Property values slipped, tempers flared, and Gregory, once so smug, now faced angry mobs of his own members demanding answers. Lawsuits were filed, but they fizzled as quickly as they started. Derek's ownership of the land was ironclad, and every county official confirmed it. Meanwhile, Derek leaned into his newfound control with quiet satisfaction. On opening day of the season, he didn't just hunt alone. He invited a group of local veterans, old friends from town, and even families who had never had the chance to set foot on such sprawling land. They brought tents, fishing poles, and campfires, filling the woods with laughter and the crackle of firewood. Derek had turned the forest into something better than a private retreat. It was now a sanctuary for people who actually respected the land. From the high fences at the trailheads, HOA members watched with bitterness as children cast lines into the creek and veterans told war stories under the stars. The very spaces they once claimed as their own now alive with a joy they were no longer welcome to share. Some even tried sneaking in, but Derek had made sure the sheriff was on his side, and trespassers quickly learned the hard way that the law backed him, not their bylaws. Gregory, humiliated, tried to save face by suggesting Derek partner with the HOA to reopen the trails for a fee, but Derek didn't even consider it. "You wanted me gone," he told Gregory coldly, "so now I've made sure you're the ones locked out." For Derek, it wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice, about showing them that arrogance and greed had consequences. Watching the HOA unravel while the land flourished under his protection was sweeter than any victory he'd ever imagined. Months passed, and the once proud HOA was a shadow of itself. The glossy brochures that once promised exclusive access to scenic trails had become a running joke in town, realtors quietly advising new buyers to look elsewhere. Gregory's grip on the board slipped as furious homeowners blamed him for the collapse of their community's prestige, and whispers circulated that he might soon be voted out entirely. Derek, meanwhile, thrived. His land became more than just property, it became a living statement. He opened it to veterans groups, survival skill workshops for kids, and even local charities who needed a safe, natural retreat. Where the HOA had seen only profit and image, Derek created something authentic, rooted in the same principles that had carried him through his life: respect, freedom, and responsibility. Still, Gregory couldn't let go. One chilly autumn afternoon, he drove his luxury SUV down the dirt road to Derek's cabin, stepping out in polished shoes that sank awkwardly into the mud. He knocked on Derek's door, looking less like the smug ruler of a neighborhood and more like a desperate man clinging to relevance. "We can make a deal," Gregory pleaded after Derek invited him onto the porch. "Reopen the trails, even partially. Charge a fee. Let the community use them again. You'll make money and we'll—" Derek cut him off with a look as sharp as steel. "Gregory, this was never about money. You tried to find me, humiliate me, and control me for doing something that was my right. You thought you owned me, just like you thought you owned this land. But you don't own either. And you never will." Gregory swallowed hard, his face pale, and for once he had no slick words to offer. Derek leaned back in his chair, the forest stretching behind him like a silent army at his back. "The trails are closed for good. That's my final word. You and your board wanted power, but now you've lost it all. Maybe next time, you'll think twice before pushing around the wrong man." Gregory left without another word, his SUV disappearing in a cloud of dust, and Derek sat quietly as the sun dipped below the trees. He had fought many battles in his life, but this one meant more than most, because it wasn't just a fight for himself. It was proof that even against arrogance, money, and false authority, one man's resolve could change everything. The HOA was finished, the land was free, and Derek Johnson had made sure that justice, at last, belonged to him.